As this story begins, we notice that the disciples are all gathered behind closed doors. Before the Pentecost is wind and fire and miraculous speech, we simply have a group of frightened people. It hasn't been so long since the crucifixion of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. I imagine they are still scared. They're in Jerusalem where all these events happened, and there they are, all together, huddled up in a room behind closed doors. I was struck this week. I met up with an old friend of mine who recently returned. She has an unusual job and an unusual set of skills, and her work regularly takes her now to Mogadishu. She is there once every 6 weeks or so. She does work. I won't try to explain it. Something to do with the dark web and her computer and Arabic skills. But she was telling me about her trips there, and I said, "Is this safe?" And she says, "Oh no, not at all." And she starts telling me about this very thin green zone that, I mean, it's like a couple of miles long, it sounds like, and very thin, and it's very close to the airport. And so she flies in there and she makes her way to this very fortified green zone where she stays in very fortified buildings, and she just doesn't leave. And she'll go to visit occasionally other people in their fortified places that they're staying. But she's telling me about the violence and unrest, and that they are headed to a famine that is as great or worse than what happened there in the 80s. And I was just struck by how profoundly sad that is, and also wishing that my friend would find another line of work. But I remember thinking that this is something that I think most of us barely are aware is happening. And there's so much of this violence and trouble in the world. We don't know what's happening, and it's not because we're cruel people or we're uninterested. It's because there's so much suffering going on in the world right now. The war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, political hostility, economic anxiety, violence, and in our own lives perhaps we have loneliness and fear about the future, and fear about whether our children will be okay. We have all of this fear in our climate and in our globe, and something within us begins shutting doors. Not necessarily physical doors, but emotional ones. I even have some wonderings if that has something to do with the pervasive loneliness of our culture. We huddle down into our safe places. I wonder if maybe compassion fatigue is one of the defining spiritual struggles of our age. The human heart can only absorb so much before it begins protecting itself. We narrow our attention, we narrow our concern, we pull inward toward what feels manageable, our family, our people, our problems, our survival. It's not because we're morally compromised, although certainly we all struggle. I think it's because we're overwhelmed. And so I look at our text today, and I wonder if in this particular moment, this might be why Pentecost matters so much. The disciples are hiding behind closed doors, not because they don't care about the problems of the world. They're hiding because they're fearful. They're exhausted. You think of our time between Easter and now, they've probably been hiding in all of that duration in fear for their lives. Their world is dangerous and unstable. Jesus has been crucified. Everything they thought was solid has come apart. And so they gather together in this small circle that they can manage. And then the Spirit comes. Luke describes it as fire and wind and languages. But beneath all of these dramatic images, something quieter and deeper is happening. I think their world is becoming larger again. Luke names all of the places that the people come from. And I am always struck, in other churches I've served, there's a lay reader that reads the text each week, so maybe we'll get to that. But I always have some compassion for the lay reader on Pentecost Sunday as you trip through Cappadocia and Pontus and Asia and Phrygia and Pamphylia. Luke goes to the trouble of naming all of these places and people. He simply could have said that Jews from throughout the Mesopotamian diaspora were gathered in Jerusalem for Pentecost. But he doesn't do that. He names each of these individual groups of people and cultures. I think we are meant to see them. We're meant to see the particularity of each of them. We're meant to see their difference. These are not just one group of people. They are actual people. They are diverse people with histories and cultures. They aren't humanity in the abstract. This isn't a vague idea of all of the people or the whole world. It's a small world after all. No, these are individual human beings, people with histories and languages and fears and stories. Pentecost is a story of radical diversity and unity together. It is hard to miss the point. It's throughout the text, even with the disciples, that they were all together in one place. The rush of the violent wind and the flames of fire filled the entire house where they were sitting. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit, and every single one of them began to speak in languages. And the devout Jews from every nation, each one of them, they gathered, and each one of them began speaking and hearing in the native language of each. This isn't everybody suddenly speaking the same language and being able to understand and communicate one another. It's everyone being able to speak and hear and understand one another in diverse languages. That is what God has called together in this place. And then we see this astonishing phrase from the prophet Joel, that in those days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. I don't know if there is a broader category than all flesh. It's not even all human beings, it's all flesh. It's almost an impossible category to think about, especially for frightened people, especially for exhausted people, especially for people trying to survive a painful world without becoming numb to it. And maybe this is why Pentecost is such a fitting end to this Easter season, where we have spent weeks talking about becoming new and how is it that the resurrection makes us new. Because one of the deepest ways that resurrection changes us is not simply that we believe new things, it's that we slowly become capable of living with more openness and more tenderness and more compassion than fear alone could ever produce. The old world is always shrinking. The resurrection world is always widening. The circles get larger and larger to include all flesh. Before Easter, the disciples keep asking anxious questions. They want to know who is in and who is out. They want to know who belongs. We hear the disciples ask Jesus, who is the greatest? We want to know who can be trusted amidst the likes of Judas and then the denials of Peter. Want to know who is our neighbor? How close and exclusive can we make that circle? And after Easter, slowly, painfully, and imperfectly, the Spirit keeps enlarging their lives. People they once feared become brothers and sisters. Voices that were foreign become understandable. The boundaries of belonging, they stretch impossibly outward. And it's not because the difference disappears. The Romans remain Romans. The Egyptians remain Egyptians. Pentecost isn't a unison voice. It's something more mysterious than that. The miracle of Pentecost is that everybody is hearing individual languages. We tend to think of it as a miracle of language when everybody suddenly can speak the language of each. It's not quite it. They can speak the language of somebody else and they can hear in another language. They all become hearable to one another again, which is, I don't even know how to comprehend that in our context. Imagine what a miracle if we could all become hearable to one another again. The miracle isn't the erasure of difference, it's the interruption of distance. Sometimes I think we see glimpses of this, although maybe quietly. I mentioned the Music Works recital on Friday night, and it's always so striking to me. We have children that are coming to us from families that are very different from the ones of this congregation. Most are Hispanic. All of them could never afford music lessons for their students. We have students who come hungry, and we raid the food bin for them because they're hungry when they show up. And every year we hold a recital, and every year some of you come, sometimes more than others, but I always find myself deeply moved because in a world that is exhausted by suffering and distracted and by the endless demands on our attention, simply showing up for another human being, it's not a small thing. We watch children one by one walk nervously up to a stage and they do something that's hard to do. They hold a violin or a trumpet or a trombone, or they sing, and each of them is able to show us what is deeply in their spirit that has to come out that day, and the tools that we have helped them to have to express that. We watch, and suddenly another person's nervousness, suddenly that matters to us. Suddenly, somebody else's success becomes our joy. It's not always through dramatic miracles that these things happen. Sometimes it's through the slow reopenings of our hearts. Sometimes through resisting the temptation to let the world become small. Fear is always trying to make our circle smaller. Smaller concerns, smaller compassion, smaller groups of belonging. But the Spirit, it rushes outward. Who can travel as fast as the wind or fire? The story begins with frightened disciples behind closed doors. By the end of it, the doors are blown open toward all of the nations they know of, toward strangers, toward humanity, toward all flesh. And so maybe one of the ways we become new is this. Not that we stop feeling fear. It's a protective emotion that we all need. Not that we stop feeling overwhelmed. It's a natural thing to feel. But that the Spirit slowly and gently keeps enlarging our capacity to remain open to one another anyway. To resist becoming numb. To resist the shrinking of our hearts. To keep practicing love in a world that rewards withdrawal. Not perfectly, not endlessly, not without exhaustion, but together, all of us. The promise of Pentecost is that human beings finally become good at loving the world. The promise is that the Spirit of God keeps bringing life back into tired hearts, and that the circle keeps widening, blown open by the Holy Spirit.